here are some musings about trying to figure out your type. No doubt, I will return to this topic many times, so think of this like a part 1. Our true type. What is a personality type exactly? Is it something that explains all our behavior? No. Is it something that explains our behavior on average? It should, in theory, yes, but not always. People are fluid. We change a lot. We might appear like many different types over the course of a single day, so we aren't stuck in these boxes. However, our true type, so to speak, is the one we can inhabit most naturally. It's the one that takes the least amount of effort for us to be. The type we are when no one is watching. I'm going to mention a few factors that affect how we come across, and therefore might muddy the water when it comes to working out what type you are. These might be fairly obvious, but they are essential to bear in mind to avoid confusing yourself. Age. Some types might not look like conventional versions of a type if they are more well developed or mature. That's, hopefully, often the case with people as they age. They're less imbalanced in lots of ways. As time goes on, people gradually improve their weaker functions. This happens after encountering repeated negative situations brought about by their imbalances. It becomes unavoidable that you have to face them. Acting. We often find ourselves in situations where we act unnaturally. It is entirely possible for a person to act contrary to their own nature for long periods of time, simply because of their external circumstances. It could be that your environment requires a very different skill set to the one you naturally possess. It could be culture, it could be peer pressure, many things. When you look at the various types, it is actually fairly easy to behave like one, or pretend to be one you're not. However, if we are behaving unnaturally and wearing a social mask, it is fundamentally unsustainable. It will eventually drain you. I think that any person, if they really tried, could successfully emulate pretty much any type. They just couldn't do it for very long, and not without massive amounts of energy. Remember that your true type is one that requires almost zero effort. Language barriers. An unusual one, but in today's age, it's an important factor. If you're a highly social ESFJ type, and you live in a country where you can't speak the language well or with confidence, you might not even come across like an extrovert at all. If you're an ENTP who loves wordplay and linguistic acrobatics, it's going to be a struggle. Maybe the ESFJ would feel more like an ISFJ, and the ENTP more like an INTP. I imagine that many of us have had the experience where we know someone for whom our language is their second language. Then, at some point, you hear them speaking their native tongue, and they speak about 10,000 times faster, and sometimes with much more force and energy. They suddenly become animated, so it's something that makes a big difference. Sex. No, that wasn't an offer. Although I'm sure this is becoming less the case, I still hear many anecdotes of women of particular types saying that they had to suppress or hide certain parts of themselves. For example, a female ENTJ might incur much more pushback or hostility from being very forceful. It's less encouraged and less rewarded socially. I've made the mistake a few times of typing female ISTPs as INFJs at first. It seemed like they had no issues with FE. However, eventually, it turned out that they had a lot of issues with it. They'd just hid it well because life had taught them to. This of course applies to men as well, where certain types might not fit societal expectations, or just of those around you, in an easy way. What are your preferences? Every person can do every function, i.e., display the behaviors and attributes you'd expect someone proficient in that function to have. The cognitive functions describe preferences. However, as I mentioned in a recent video, these preferences can feel, or simply be, physiological. For example, a high FE user, such as an ENFJ or ESFJ, isn't going to foster harmony just because they think it's the right thing to do. They also have an instinctive aversion to certain kinds of conflict. It makes them feel bad, or weird, or off in some way. All of the functions have this effect in varying ways, depending on the type. So, your type is more a reflection of what you prefer, and not necessarily an indication of your strengths and weaknesses. If you prefer something, and use or do it more as a result, chances are you'll become better at it. But it's not clear-cut. You can become good, or great even, at things you don't like, and wish you didn't have to do or use. That often happens in life. So when typing yourself, it's essential to follow these physiological feelings. What excites you? What fills you with dread? What gives you energy out of nowhere? What drains you completely? When are you loving life or hating life? When do you have momentum? When are you stuck in inertia? All of these things are indicators, things that point to preferences. Where do you start? Well, wherever you start slowly. Finding out your type is not going to be straightforward for many people, maybe even most people. You might happen to be a clear-cut version of a type, in which case it's a lot easier, but most of the time these archetypes only partially capture us. We blur the lines between them. typing yourself requires self-awareness and attachment. You have to be able to see yourself as other people see you, to view yourself from a third-person perspective. That creates a conflict between your intent and motivations and your behavior. For example, if you're someone who is brutally honest with people, that, in many ways, is a sign of respect to them. You want to give them the unfiltered truth because you want to help them. You want them to grow, be better, and be happier. However, from the perspective of the people receiving this bluntness, they might see you as hurtful, or rude even. So you need to be able to see past your own biases. That is not easy. An ideal situation is to find people who know both you and typology well. As I'm sure many of you know, that is unlikely to happen. Contrast and compare. Classifying your personality is about placing yourself on a spectrum. If you're 8 foot tall on a planet of 20 foot tall people, then you're short. These things are relative. One of the reasons that many people start off by realizing that they're an introvert or extrovert first, before delving deeper, is because it's a very obvious comparison to make. You will simply notice that the other person has much more social stamina than you, or that they get drained socially much more quickly. After encountering enough people, you can see how introverted or extroverted you are. Basically, you want to do the same thing, this same comparison, except for everything. You really can start anywhere, but start with traits. Don't worry too much initially about the functions. The functions are simply ways of grouping traits and cognitive preferences together, after all. For example, let's say the trait of being organized. First ponder it and define it. What does it mean to be organized? Well, in part, it's about getting things done quickly, efficiently, and without too much friction and stress. It's also about prioritizing well. An organized person will get through a to-do list of tasks very well, because they'll know which order to do them in. For this to work, you need a decent-sized sample set. If you look at a parent of yours and conclude that they are more organized, then that hardly tells you much. This is yet another reason why typing yourself takes a long time. Eventually, you can place yourself with precision on this spectrum. If you do this with enough traits, you'll build up a very good picture of yourself, one that will map much more easily onto a specific type. Situations. Along with comparing and contrasting traits, do the same for situations. Let's take the example of moving house, specifically packing up your stuff. How would you approach this? Would you leap into it right away and just power through? Would you spend a long time pondering the best approach? Would you come up with a systematic approach of doing it? Would you invite people over to help you? How quickly would it take for you to get drained by the process? Does it fill you with dread to even think about it? Does it feel like something you can only do in short bursts? Again, place yourself on a spectrum in relation to other people. If you find yourself at the extreme end of every spectrum, then something has gone wrong with your self-assessment. For many things, you will be average, or quite good, and quite bad. Finding those traits or functions that you're decent at is equally as important as finding your strengths and weaknesses. It's important to also note, not every situation will show every function in a clear way. The quickest way to type yourself. I first heard this advice from Michael Pierce, and I think it's brilliant. If you want to work out your own type, then just try different types on. Simply act like a type for a while and see what it feels like. If it takes a lot of effort to act that way, then it's probably not your type. This is less fake it till you make it and more fake it till you find it. I really advocate for this approach because it also challenges you to really ponder what exactly a certain type will act like or think like. For example, if you decide to act like an ENTP, but you don't really know what they act like, then it's not going to work. Let's say you're torn between two types. You think you might be an INTP or possibly an ISTP. In that case, you could try embodying an ESTP. If you find that you can do that decently, then that might indicate ISTP fits better. And if you fail miserably to do it and can barely sustain it at all, then that would suggest INTP. That is simply because INTPs and ESTPs are extremely different, whereas ISTPs and ESTPs have a lot in common and are much more closely related. Being in a mad rush to figure out your type is a mistake. Much of the useful stuff in typology will come from the self-reflection inherent within the process of figuring out your type. If you're someone who, for the life of you, can't figure out your type and have tried for years, then typology might not be that useful for you in that area anyway. You might simply be an unusual version of a type, to the point where these archetypes don't give you anything useful. Remember, only use this stuff if it's useful to you. If you enjoy this channel, then please subscribe. It makes a big difference to the channel overall, but also this individual video. And if you don't like the channel, then I appreciate the masochism of you watching this video all the way through. Please follow that impulse further, and also subscribe.